Tsui's solo debut was pretty bland for me. There's no beating around the bush. And frankly, I tend to ignore releases like this on my channel since there's not much substance to discuss. And despite how it may seem, I don't like being overly negative on my channel. If I can't compliment the release on at least one thing, I tend to keep my opinions to myself. That would have remained the case if it weren't for the strange discourse surrounding it. While I wasn't particularly drawn to the song, the real conversation I want to have is about the reaction to her debut. It's hard to ignore how the performances of her title track Runaway ended up overshadowing the entire project. As part of her promotions, Tsui appeared on various weekly music shows, performing solo without the other members of Twice as you'd expect. This solo spotlight made it much clearer that Tsui's facial expressions during the performances were a bit stiff, something those familiar with her role in Twice already knew. In the context of Twice, Tsui shines as a key part of the group's dynamic. I'd compare her presence to a garnish. She's not the main course, but she adds that finishing touch that completes the dish. However, without her fellow members, Tsui's weaknesses were highlighted and laid bare. There were claims that she had the worst stage presence ever. A gross exaggeration to be sure. Yet this sentiment started making the rounds, and it stuck for weeks after her debut. It's clear that her performances weren't without flaw, but the reaction seemed disproportionate. Ultimately, though, this is a subjective matter, so I can't technically counter-argue it. While I don't think it's the worst I've ever seen, I can't stop others from coming to that conclusion. A bigger and frankly more interesting point of discussion was an idea that kept popping up, that not all K-pop idols deserve a solo debut. This notion really caught me off guard because of the implication that one needed to be worthy of having a solo debut, and presumably someone would be the judge of that. But who in the world has the authority to make that assessment, and based on what? If Tsui sings well enough, dances well enough, has enough stage presence? Need I remind you, all of which is subject to personal opinion and can change from person to person. There is no correct opinion on Tsui's skill, and theoretically no one fit to determine whether she deserved to make a solo debut. While people may have a general consensus on the quality of her stage presence, that should not bar her from ever releasing a project. This idea is also firmly a K-pop concept, right? Because despite how contentious people's opinions surrounding music is, I've never seen the audience call a debut undeserved. They'll say it sucks, or it's the worst release in human history, or it should have stayed in the drafts. But never undeserved. The idea of deserving a solo debut is something I've never contemplated because I've never approached music from that lens. If someone comes out with a project, it's because they created something they wanted to share with the world, not because they surpassed some arbitrary criteria and earned the right to release music. The concept of deserving a solo debut just doesn't align with how artistry and personal growth actually work. Now, this approach is slightly altered due to the nature of the K-pop industry. Compared to traditional musicians, idols don't have a role in music creation, especially at the start of their careers. So the decision to release music, and what kind, often lies more with the company than the artist. They are also usually guided through their projects by producers, choreographers, and managers, rather than it being their own vision, cultivated with the help of others, making it less about an individual's artist's vision and more about the brand image or commercial strategy of the agency. I think that this setup is what fuels the idea that a solo debut, a divergence from this formula, must be deserved, because it's seen as a privilege granted to the most talented or the most popular members of a group. As a result, the audience can sometimes feel more entitled to question whether an idol has earned a solo debut. However, I'd argue that releasing a solo project is fundamentally different from group releases in K-pop. Another Twice member, Jihyo, I'm really hoping I'm pronouncing that right. For some reason I can pronounce Tsui, but I can't pronounce Jihyo, I don't know. Regardless, she already set the precedent by openly stating that despite fans' wishes, she had no desire to pursue a solo career. Meaning that Tsui's decision to do so came from a place of wanting to pave her own path distinct from Twice, and to make something characteristically her. To promote as a K-pop group is to perform whatever music the company sees fit to give you. But to go out of your way to debut solo signifies a desire to branch out and maybe even explore genres or concepts that you couldn't otherwise confine to your group. An approach that aligns more with the traditional way that artists release music. Speaking of the other Twice members, the criticism towards Tsui's debut definitely got worse because people kept comparing her to Nayeon and Jihyo. Both of them brought so much energy to their solo stages, with dancing and charisma that really set the bar for what people expect from a new era of K-pop soloists. Even if you're not the biggest fan of their songs, it's hard to deny that they had that wow factor on stage. So Tsui's more low-key style stood out even more in comparison, which probably made the feedback feel a lot harsher. Compounded onto that, people started throwing the fact that Tsui was an idol with more than a decade of stage experience. Why was she so bad? While the criticism is valid, and I'm not trying to argue that it isn't, I would put forward that the skills needed to perform as part of a group differ significantly from those required for solo performances. Nayeon and Jihyo benefited from having a majority of solo lines and more killer parts during their promotion of Twice, which allowed them to hone their stage presence. In contrast, Tsui excelled at delivering her parts in the songs, of which she had maybe 1 or 2 lines. But she was never expected to carry an entire performance on her own. But again, that critique is par for the course. While I don't think there should be strict barriers to releasing music, you do have to be prepared for people to comment on your stage presence once you're out there, whether it be good or bad. It's not about blocking anyone from debuting solo. It's more about knowing that people will hold you to certain standards. It's not the end of the world for Tsui to debut solo with room for improvement. It will become a problem if this is the level that she stays at for the entirety of her solo career. But I still don't think she needs to emulate Nayeon or Jihyo's explosive energy on stage to be considered good. Honestly, it would look really strange for her to perform the way that they do. Something more subtle, but emphasizing elegance and classiness would really suit her, in my opinion. All in all, I think she just needs time to figure out what works for her. In fact, I always like bringing up Dua Lipa when it comes to skills in performing. For people in the know of pop culture, you probably know where I'm going with this. Basically, Dua Lipa performed her hit song New Rules at the Brit Awards in 2018. To say it was underwhelming would be generous. Someone ended up commenting underneath the video, "Go girl, give us nothing." Basically, this comment is what would come to serve as the basis of a meme, which would plague pop stars for years to come. It was screenshotted and shared everywhere. It became so prevalent that some of you may even associate it with Jennie's past scandal of lazy dancing, since the phrase started being used with any and all performances that were considered lackluster. Dua Lipa never addressed the memes about her at the time, but since then, the improvement in her dancing, stage presence, and energy is like night and day. While the meme surfaced near the beginning of her career, she actually debuted 3 years prior. Enough time that most people expected her to perform at a standard that she simply didn't. Since then, though, Dua Lipa is considered to be on par with her peers. Moral of the story, it's never too late. It's about what you do with what you have now. Ultimately, if Tsui wants to release music, she's fully within her right to do so. She doesn't need the public's permission. Just because some people think she's better suited to group performances or that her stage work needs improvement doesn't mean that she shouldn't have the freedom to explore her potential as a solo artist. Whether or not her initial release met everyone's expectations, the choice to release music should be hers and hers alone. Even if her debut didn't resonate with everyone, the fact that Tsui was able to take a step outside her familiar role in Twice to explore something new is worth noting. That's something she's entitled to do, just as much as any other artist. Not every debut has to be groundbreaking or iconic. Sometimes it's about experimenting, finding your voice, and building on it over time. Anyway, that'll be the video for today. That'll be it from me for now. See y'all later. Bye-bye!